Hi, this is Jonathan. My pursuit for tones, guitar tones, is quite a complex and complicated thing. When I first starting out playing in a band, I was using an amplifier, as most of us do. And amplifiers are tricky things. The amp itself, whether it's tube or whether it's transistors, it plays an important part for your quest for the ultimate sound. And I've always find it a challenge for me because every club that I play, sometimes they have different amps. They have the Fender Twins, they have the Marshalls, the GMP 800. They have all sorts of, of generic amps that we would use in clubs back then. It was after I've saved enough money and bought a Yamaha amp. And that was a transistor amp, but it was such a heavy beast. I would carry around and place it in the clubs that I play. But I run the risk because back then, clubs would go out of business. The creditors would come, seal up the place, and our instruments would be locked up inside. And I had experienced it once in the club that I used to play, and I think it ran out of money, and the creditors came, and then the law came, and the whole place was sealed up with our equipment inside. It took a while for us to get back and claim back our instruments. So after that, I decided I sold off my amp and decided not to take the risk. In fact, every time we play in a club and we see that, if we see that the club isn't doing too well, I will probably bring my instruments and effects home every night. But that's not the case because back then the clubs were thriving, the business was good. The quest for the ultimate sound will also result in you buying a lot of effects. And this is part of a series that I thought of, I'll touch on how to get the tones that you want, the guitar, the quest for the ultimate tone, in your journey as an electric guitarist. And it all started out with the amps, as I said. If the amp is a good amp, then it's easy to get tones out of it. And the tube amps, for me, I always prefer the tube amps because I find that it's warmer, the attack is smoother. It's, in many ways, it's not as clean as a transistor amp, but I like the characteristic of a tube amp. Now, back in those days, when I was first starting out, I would plug in the effects chamber, go like this: the guitar into your effects to your amplifier. And it creates a whole lot of problem, as I discovered much later on. Nowadays, in a modern amp, you can find an effects loop at the back of the amp, and this allows you the capability to patch through your effects after your preamp stage. So this is really useful for an amp that you really like, and you like the distortion sound of it. It gives you the capability to have a distortion sound, or even a solo sound. Some of the amps that comes into mind are probably the Sedanos, those exotic amps, the Sedanos, the Mesa Boogies, and all these amps have wonderful tube, sound that you can actually play a solo on or do distortion chords or anything, and you want that sound, but you want other stuff too. You want your effects, so you patch in whatever you need to do. So in most cases, at the effects loop at the back, I will patch in, that's me, the time-based units like choruses, delays, tremolo, reverb, if you don't want to use the reverb from the amp. And this will give you the ability to have your guitar signal come into the amp, and then utilizing the amps, the preamp of the amp, the distortion of the amp, or whatever you have, the solo sound, solo section, the EQ of the amp, and then after that, going through the effects loop, going through the time-based unit, and then coming back again to the speakers. That's how it works. Or if I wanted to add a compressor, I would probably do it right after my guitar. So guitar, compressor, or noise gate, and then into the amp. This is how I do it. So it's a good thing, It's a good thing for us guitarists to have this ability to do all this and not sacrifice the quality of sound. Because what happens is when you patch directly into your amp, like for example guitar, you have a bunch of effects into your amp, whatever noise that is generated through the time base, or rather to the various effects, you would multiply it as you go into the amp. Because you'll go through a preamp, and then you will amplify it, and then you come up from the amp, from the speakers. And it robs you the ability to use the whatever distortion that, or distortion preamp that this amp has. It could be good, but it could be nice, but you couldn't use it because you have all your effects coming in, and then it has to go through distortion. Imagine you have all your delays and your choruses going to the amp, and then going through the distortion part of it, and then coming out from the speaker. It's gonna sound ugly. Yeah. So most of the time, back in those days, I would find a good amp, a good, clean, powerful amp. I'm not looking for the distortion or the amp sound, whatever distortion or whatever creamy sound that the preamps can deliver. I would just look for like a Roland JC120. These are like good solid amps with good clean sound, and that's where I depend on my effects unit. So this is how I roll last time. And henceforth, I got into this chase for effects. This ultimate hunt for the best effect. Well, back then there was only Ibanez and Boss, and they were like the pioneers of most of the effects. Of course, there are some effects from the States which we couldn't get because it would cost a bomb, for them to import over there. Of course, there's MXR and stuff like the Red. Remember the Red distortion unit. So the mainstay back then for us musicians, us local musicians back then, was either Ibanez or Boss. And I went through a whole bunch of effects. I think I spent more money on effects than anything else. I bought the compressors, the CS1 back then, the the orange tube OD1, the Ibanez, and then a bunch of other stuff. And if I would have kept some of it, I would probably make a huge chunk of money. A huge chunk of money if I sell them off. but didn't know better, so I either sold it off or gave it away. I had about, at one time, at the peak, I had about 12 effects, and those little plastic case that boss used to come up with to house your effects. I ran out of space, so I would carry some of the stuff, and then it was a problem for me to find power supplies for this. Back then, it didn't have pedal boards, like what we have now, custom-made pedal boards. No, we don't have it unless you're willing to spend some money. But most of the time, we would just go for the generic ones that was available in the market. So I had all this. I went through all this, and it was complicated, to say the least, for me. At times, I get so confused as to where to place each effects, on the chain of effects, which should go first, which should go last. And I had to ask for help for some of my peers, as well as my elders, those guys who have been around. And I would call them and ask for advice. And I'm not shy to do this. I'm on the quest to learn. So when I want to learn something, I would ask for it, and goes away the ego goes away, throw away the ego, throw away any pride that I had then, and just went and asked. And some would tell you, some won't tell you, but nevertheless I tried, so I learned what I can. And then again, it also boils down to the fact that I'm willing to experiment. So each night in every set, I would experiment different configurations, like for example, most of us use this configuration, like a compressor first, and then followed by a distortion or an overdrive, or 2 units, distortion, overdrive, and then you can have the chorus, and then the delay, and right after that you have the reverb. Now most of the time we will not use the reverb as a individual effect unit. We will probably use the reverb from the amp. But sometimes the amp reverbs are a bit lacking, and if you have better reverbs out there, like plate or a room, more exotic reverbs rather than the spring reverb that most amps have, then it'd be great. Then you can have yourself a nice reverb effect. So this is how the configuration would go. So I would try different things. I would try like maybe a chorus before the distortion, and I'll figure out to find which one suits my style of playing and my genre. And after a while, this is a configuration that I was going for most of my career. Years later, I changed to a multi-effect, like the Line 6 stuff. I still retain the configuration, more or less. In fact, it became even more complicated, but I will leave it for another video, for part 2 maybe. So this is how I go about understanding the effect chain. And I would spend nights at coffee houses, or when after the set I would sit down and draw diagrams and find out, and probably discuss with some of my guitarist friends, and try to configure out, okay, so if I go through this, how much noise would I get? And if I get that much noise, because the compressor, how compressor works, compressors will enhance your noise from your pickups, especially if they're not grounded or they're single coil. And how do I eliminate that? And if I go through a distortion, how bad will it get? So, is there a need for a noise gate? And where's the noise gate supposed to be? Stuff like that. So I kind of figure out this whole thing by myself and with the help of some friends. So I advise you to do the same thing as to how you would want your effects chain to be, which go first and all that. Do not be afraid to experiment. We have become a generation of shortcuts. We want to do everything the fastest way. Okay, I see this, I would just get it. I see this guy do this way, I would just follow suit. That leaves little room for creativity. That leaves little room for experimentation. Well, certain things are more or less set, but you can always experiment different configurations and different choices of amps, different choices of guitars. So I encourage you guys to go about looking for ways to try out new things, and maybe, who knows, you come up with new sounds, a sound that is different from other people. I could name a whole bunch of guitarists who has their unique sound because of their choice of effects that they use. This, of course, like I said, is a series, so I would discuss like every unit. For example, the compressors. I'll try to cover as much as I can. Is what can you do, or how can you get the maximum advantage of a unit. And it all depends on. Against there's this price range. There are the exotic pedals which cost a bomb, and there are the generic ones that work. But if you want something more, you probably have to pay. I have given all that and have opted for the Helix or the Line 6 stuff because they work. Seriously, they work. The Kemper, if you choose to use a Kemper, why not? Go for it. Even the plugins that we have in our digital workstation, like guitar rig, amplitude, they have wonderful effects. So go for it and experiment and see what you can come up with. Now, one thing you must understand is that you have to have a good sound coming out from your guitar directly to the amp. And if you have that tone there, if you're happy with that tone that you get just by plugging your guitar into your amplifier, that's the tone. That's the tone that you're working on. And the effects are just to enhance. They are not necessarily there to change your tone drastically. They are there to enhance whatever genre you're playing, what sort of music you're playing. More or less put yourself out into the mix so that you can be heard sometimes. And there are effects like choruses and delays. These are more of a background thing. If you're gonna play like what the Edge do in YouTube, these are all the background stuff that you can layer stuff and all that. You must understand, and you must have the frame of mind to know that what you're doing live and what you're doing on recordings are two separate entities. So how you approach effects live is very different from how you approach your effects in a recording situation. So I'll talk more about that probably in the second video. In general, if you want to get a pedal, do your research. Because nowadays there are a whole lot of pedals that have dual function. For example, you have pedals that have overdrive as well as distortion, and vice versa. And you have pedals like the ones on TC Electronics where you have multiple delays. You can switch from delay ones. There's one unit I believe that have 4 delays in it. I'll try and get you the model up somewhere here. And you have this whole palette of sound to choose from. And the choruses, of course, you have the tri-choruses, you have many configurations, but all these effects take up valuable space. So if you're going to get effects, individual effects like this, be prepared to have a pedal board probably that big. Then you got to lug it, you got to think about it, you got to lug this to your gig. And don't forget the volume pedal and the other stuff that you have. So my question to you is, what do you think constitutes an effect? It could be a pedal. The tremolo arm is an effect. The wah-wah pedal is an effect, right? Your volume knob is an effect when you're doing volume swells. Your volume pedal, is an effect. If you see it that way, a slide, the bottle snake slide is an effect. You have the e-bowl, that's an effect. So. My question to you is, what do you think of this as an effect to enhance your sound or to change your sound, whether in a live situation or in the recordings? For me, all these are effects. That's me. Okay, I treat all this as effects. It takes a while to play this stuff like the bottleneck, the slide, and all that. It takes practice to master some of the stuff. Whereas for an effects pedal, all you need to do is just to turn it on and off, and the effects will come out. So this is the only difference. But for me, everything is an effect. All this is a tool for me to. It's like what brush should I use? When I'm painting a painting. When I have a palette of colors, what brush should I use? A broad stroke, a smaller brush, a thinner brush, or using my fingers? These are all part of a process for you to come up with a sound that is unique and pleasing to your ears as well as to others. So share with me what you think in the comment section down below. Look out for the subsequent series, subsequent parts in this series. So if you like this video, give me a thumbs up, and as usual, if you want to subscribe to this channel, please feel free to go ahead, and I'll see you again in the next video. So In the meantime, take care of yourself. Ciao.